What if I told you that a man could vanish from his own life? Not because he wanted to, but because someone decided he didn't deserve to exist anymore. What if I told you that for 7 years, a family searched for answers that were buried beneath lies, silence, and a conspiracy so dark that even the people closest to the truth refused to speak? This is not a story about a missing person. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people become monsters, and when one man's fight for justice becomes a war against an entire system designed to forget him. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm about to tell you the story of Terrence Paquette, a man whose name was erased from the 1990s like he never existed at all. And by the time you reach the end of this story, you're going to understand why some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep they're hidden. But here's the thing. If you scroll away right now, you'll never know how this ends. You'll never know who was responsible. You'll never know about the one mistake they made that brought everything crashing down. And honestly, if this story doesn't make you feel something, then maybe nothing will. So do me a favor. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever felt like the world forgot you existed, share this video right now. Subscribe to this channel, because Terrence's story deserves to be heard, and you might be the reason someone else finally learns the truth. Let me take you back to 1991. Small-town America. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where secrets travel faster than news, and where the wrong kind of attention can make you disappear long before anyone realizes you're gone. Terrence Paquette was 34 years old when I first heard his name. He worked at the local lumber mill, the same mill his father had worked at, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Paquettes had built their lives around that mill, around the rhythm of saws and the smell of fresh-cut pine. Terrence wasn't a remarkable man by most standards. He didn't have money. He didn't have power. He didn't have the kind of face that made people stop and stare. But he had something else. He had a sense of right and wrong so strong that it would eventually cost him everything. The town was called Millbrook, though you won't find it on most maps anymore. It was the kind of place that existed between larger places, a rest stop for people passing through, a final destination for people who had nowhere else to go. The population hovered around 3,000, give or take, depending on the season and the economy. When the mill was doing well, Millbrook thrived. When the mill struggled, so did everyone else. In 1991, the mill was doing better than it had in years. A new contract with a construction company downstate had brought in more orders than they could handle. Workers were putting in overtime. Families were finally catching up on bills. For the first time in a decade, there was talk of expansion, of hiring new workers, of building something that might last. Terrence was one of the senior operators. He'd been at the mill for 16 years, starting as a teenager sweeping floors and working his way up to running one of the main cutting stations. He was good at his job, reliable, the kind of worker who showed up early and left late, who never complained about the hours or the conditions. Management liked him. His co-workers respected him. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person a small town needed to survive. But here's what nobody talked about. Here's what I didn't learn until years later, when the truth finally started to surface like a body floating up from deep water. Terrence Paquette had started asking questions. It began with the accident reports. 3 workers had been injured in the past 6 months, all of them on the night shift, all of them on equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The mill's owner, a man named Douglas Harmon, had been cutting corners for years, saving money by ignoring safety regulations and hoping that nothing would go wrong. When things did go wrong, Harmon had a system. He paid off the injured workers, convinced them to sign agreements that prevented them from talking, and made the problems disappear. It had worked for years. It would have kept working forever. Except Terrence Paquette wouldn't let it go. He started keeping records. He started taking photographs. He started talking to the other workers, the ones who had been injured, the ones who were too scared to speak up, the ones who had families depending on their silence. He was building a case, though he didn't call it that. He called it doing the right thing. What Terrence didn't understand was that doing the right thing in Millbrook was the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. Douglas Harmon found out about the records in September of 1991. He found out about the photographs. He found out about the conversations Terrence was having with workers who had been paid to stay quiet. And that's when everything changed. I want you to picture this. A Tuesday evening. The leaves are just starting to turn. Terrence finishes his shift and walks to his truck, the same rusted Ford he'd been driving for a decade. He waves to a couple of coworkers. He stops to light a cigarette. He climbs into the driver's seat and puts the key in the ignition. He never makes it home. His truck is found the next morning, parked on a back road 3 miles from town. The engine is still running. The driver's door is open. Terrence's wallet is on the dashboard. His keys are in the ignition. But Terrence Paquette is gone. No struggle. No witnesses. No explanation. Just gone. The police investigation lasts exactly 11 days. They interview a handful of people. They search the woods around where the truck was found. They put up a few flyers. And then, quietly, they close the case. Missing person. Probable voluntary disappearance. Case inactive. Terrence Paquette had a mother who refused to accept that explanation. He had a younger sister who knew something was wrong. He had friends who remembered the questions he'd been asking, the records he'd been keeping, the enemies he'd been making. But none of that mattered to the official record. According to the town of Millbrook, Terrence Paquette simply walked away from his life and never looked back. For 7 years, that was the story. For 7 years, his family searched alone. For 7 years, the people who knew what really happened kept their silence. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the truth has a way of finding people who think they've escaped it. Margaret Paquette was 63 years old when her son disappeared. She had raised 3 children on her own after her husband died in a logging accident when Terrence was only 12. She had worked double shifts at the diner on Main Street, scrubbing floors and serving coffee to people who barely noticed she existed. She had sacrificed everything so her children could have something better. Terrence was her oldest. He was the one who had stayed. He was the one who checked on her every Sunday, who fixed the leaky faucet in her bathroom, who brought groceries when money was tight. He was her anchor, the reason she kept getting up every morning, the proof that her sacrifices had meant something. When the police told her that Terrence had probably just left town, that he had probably just decided to start over somewhere else, Margaret looked the detective straight in the eyes and said something I'll never forget. She said, "My son would never leave without telling me goodbye. Whatever happened to him, he didn't choose it." The detective nodded politely. He wrote something in his notebook, and then he walked away, leaving Margaret standing in her living room with a truth she couldn't prove and a grief she couldn't process. Sandra Paquette was 29 when her brother disappeared. She was the youngest of the 3 siblings, the only one who had left Millbrook for college, the only one who had built a life somewhere else. She was working as a paralegal in Boston when she got the phone call from her mother. She drove through the night to get home, arriving at dawn to find police tape around her brother's abandoned truck in a town that had already started to forget. Sandra was different from her mother. Where Margaret carried her grief quietly, Sandra carried her anger like a weapon. She demanded answers from the police. She demanded access to the investigation files. She demanded that someone, anyone, take her brother's disappearance seriously. Nobody did. The chief of police was a man named Warren Caldwell, and he had known Douglas Harmon for 30 years. They had grown up together. They had gone to the same church. Their wives played bridge together on Thursday nights. When Sandra started suggesting that her brother's disappearance might be connected to his questions about the mill, Caldwell shut her down immediately. He told her she was being hysterical. He told her she was inventing conspiracies. He told her that if she kept making accusations, he would have to consider whether she was interfering with an official investigation. Sandra left Millbrook 3 weeks after arriving. But she didn't stop fighting. The 3rd sibling was Michael, 2 years younger than Terrence and nothing like him. Michael had struggled his whole life. He had dropped out of high school. He had bounced from job to job. He had a temper that got him into trouble and a drinking problem that made everything worse. When Terrence disappeared, Michael was living in a trailer on the edge of town, working occasional shifts at a gas station and trying to stay out of his brother's shadow. Michael's relationship with Terrence had been complicated. He loved his brother, but he also resented him. Terrence was everything Michael could never be. Reliable, respected, successful. When people in Millbrook talked about the Paquette family, they talked about Terrence. Michael was an afterthought, a disappointment, a cautionary tale. After the disappearance, Michael went into a spiral that lasted years. He drank more. He worked less. He pushed away everyone who tried to help him. He blamed himself for not being closer to his brother, for not noticing something was wrong, for not being the kind of person people trusted enough to share their secrets with. What Michael didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Terrence had tried to tell him something 2 days before he vanished. They had been at a bar on the edge of town, one of the only places Michael and Terrence ever spent time together. Terrence had been quiet, distracted, checking the door every few minutes like he was expecting someone. Finally, after his 3rd beer, he had leaned close to Michael and started to say something. "If anything happens to me." Michael had laughed. He had cut his brother off. He had made a joke about Terrence being paranoid. And Terrence had gone quiet again, finishing his drink and leaving without another word. Michael would replay that moment for the rest of his life. He would hear his brother's voice in his dreams, always stopping at the same place, always leaving the sentence unfinished. "If anything happens to me." What? What was Terrence going to say? What did he want Michael to know? Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever had a moment where someone tried to tell you something important and you didn't listen? Have you ever dismissed someone's fear because it seemed irrational, only to realize later that they were trying to warn you about something real? Think about that moment. Think about what you would give to go back and listen. Drop a comment below and tell me about it. Because Michael Paquette spent years drowning in that regret, and maybe sharing yours will help you understand what comes next. The family searched on their own. Margaret put up flyers. Sandra hired a private investigator with money she couldn't afford to spend. Michael drove the back roads at night, looking for something, anything, that might explain what had happened to his brother. None of it worked. The trail had gone cold before it ever got warm. The police had stopped looking. The town had stopped caring. And slowly, painfully, the Paquette family began to accept that they might never know the truth. But accepting something doesn't mean believing it. And somewhere deep inside each of them, a flame kept burning, a refusal to let go, a determination that someday, somehow, the answers would come. What they didn't know was that the answers were closer than they thought, and the person who held them was about to make a mistake that would change everything. Small towns have long memories but short attention spans. In the weeks after Terrence Paquette vanished, everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. The diner was full of whispers, and the bar was full of speculation. But as weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, the whispers faded. The speculation stopped. Life went on. That's how Douglas Harmon wanted it. Harmon was 61 years old in 1991, a self-made man who had built the lumber mill from nothing and turned it into the economic engine of Millbrook. He was respected. He was feared. He was the kind of man who could make problems disappear simply by deciding they weren't worth his time. But Terrence Paquette had been different. Terrence hadn't been intimidated. Terrence hadn't taken the money. Terrence hadn't understood that some fights couldn't be won. What happened on the night Terrence disappeared is something I can only piece together from fragments. From statements made years later. From confessions that came too late. From the guilt that eventually consumed the people who kept silent. There were 3 of them that night. 3 men who worked for Douglas Harmon in ways that had nothing to do with cutting lumber. They had been watching Terrence for weeks, learning his patterns, waiting for the right moment. The moment came on that Tuesday evening, on that back road 3 miles from town. They forced his truck to stop. They dragged him from the driver's seat. And they took him to a place where no one would ever find him. I won't describe what happened next. Some things don't need to be put into words. What matters is that Terrence Paquette, a man whose only crime was believing in doing the right thing, was silenced forever by people who couldn't afford to let him speak. His records were destroyed. His photographs were burned. The workers he had been talking to were threatened into silence. And Douglas Harmon went back to running his mill, confident that the problem had been solved. For 7 years, he was right. The silence in Millbrook was thick enough to choke on. People knew something had happened. They had to know. In a town that small, secrets don't stay secret. But knowing and speaking are 2 different things, and the people of Millbrook had learned long ago that speaking could be dangerous. There was a waitress at the diner who had overheard a conversation she shouldn't have. She never told anyone what she heard. There was a mechanic who had noticed the damage to a truck that matched the description of the one used that night. He never reported it. There was a pastor who had received a confession from a man racked with guilt. He never broke that confidence. The silence was everywhere. It was in the way people avoided eye contact when Margaret Paquette walked down the street. It was in the way conversations stopped when Sandra came to town asking questions. It was in the nervous laughter that followed whenever Terrence's name came up in passing. Everyone knew. No one spoke. That's the thing about small towns. They protect their own. And Douglas Harmon, for all his sins, was one of their own in a way that Terrence Paquette, for all his virtues, could never be. Harmon employed people. Harmon paid taxes. Harmon kept Millbrook alive. Terrence had just been asking questions. And questions, in a place like Millbrook, were dangerous things. But silence has a weight to it. It presses down on people. It makes them tired. It makes them careless. And eventually, inevitably, it makes them talk. The crack in the wall of silence started with a man named Ray Dalton. Ray had been one of the three. He had been there that night. He had helped drag Terrence from his truck. He had watched what happened next. And for 7 years, he had carried that weight, drinking to forget, working to stay busy, doing anything to avoid the memories that came for him in the darkness. By 1998, Ray was a broken man. His wife had left him. His kids wouldn't speak to him. He was living alone in a one-room apartment above a hardware store, spending his nights staring at the ceiling and his days counting the hours until he could drink again. It was the guilt that finally got to him, not the fear of being caught, not the threat of punishment, just the simple, crushing weight of having helped destroy an innocent man. Ray Dalton walked into the Millbrook Police Department on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1998 and asked to speak to someone about a missing persons case. The silence was about to break. Warren Caldwell was still the chief of police in 1998. He was 72 years old, 3 months from retirement, and the last thing he wanted was for the past to come knocking on his door. When Ray Dalton walked into the station, Caldwell felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew this moment was coming. He had known it for 7 years. Caldwell wasn't innocent. He hadn't participated in what happened to Terrence Paquette, but he had helped cover it up. He had closed the investigation. He had discouraged anyone from asking questions. He had protected Douglas Harmon because that was what he had always done, and because he didn't know how to do anything else. But Ray Dalton wasn't coming to confess to Caldwell. He was coming to confess to a younger detective, a man named Thomas Reyes who had only been in Millbrook for 2 years and who had no loyalty to anyone except the truth. Reyes was 31, ambitious, and completely unaware of the political dynamics that made Millbrook function. When Ray Dalton started talking, Reyes listened. He took notes. He asked questions. And when Ray was finished, Reyes did something that no one in Millbrook had done in 7 years. He believed him. The confession was detailed. Ray described the planning. He described the execution. He described the location where Terrence's body had been buried, a piece of land owned by one of Harmon's shell companies, overgrown now and forgotten. Ray named the other 2 men who had been involved. He named Douglas Harmon as the one who had given the order, and he named Warren Caldwell as the one who had made sure no one ever found out. Reyes was smart enough to know that this information could get him killed if he wasn't careful. He was also smart enough to know that he couldn't trust anyone in Millbrook with what he had just learned. So he did something that would change everything. He called the state police. Within 48 hours, Millbrook was crawling with investigators who owed nothing to Douglas Harmon and feared nothing from Warren Caldwell. They found the burial site within a week. They found Terrence Paquette's remains, still wrapped in the tarp that had been his shroud for 7 years. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Douglas Harmon was arrested at his office, in front of his employees, in front of the town he had controlled for 3 decades. Warren Caldwell resigned before he could be charged, though the charges came anyway. The other 2 men who had been involved confessed within hours of being questioned, each trying to blame the others, each hoping to save themselves. Margaret Paquette was 70 years old when she finally learned what had happened to her son. She was sitting in her living room when Thomas Reyes came to deliver the news. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and whispered 2 words that I'll never forget. I knew. She had known all along. Not the details, not the specifics, but she had known that her son hadn't left voluntarily. She had known that something terrible had happened. She had known that the town was lying to her face and smiling while they did it. And now, after 7 years of fighting, after 7 years of being told she was wrong, she had been proven right. Sandra Paquette drove through the night again, just like she had 7 years earlier. But this time, she wasn't driving toward uncertainty. She was driving toward justice. The trial of Douglas Harmon lasted 3 weeks. It was covered by newspapers across the state. It exposed the corruption that had allowed a man to be murdered and forgotten. It revealed the cowardice of a town that had chosen silence over truth. Harmon was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The other 2 men received similar sentences. Warren Caldwell died of a heart attack before his trial could begin, taking whatever secrets he still held to the grave. For the first time in 7 years, Terrence Paquette's name was spoken with respect. His story was told with honesty. His sacrifice was acknowledged. But justice, I learned, is never as simple as a verdict. The conviction of Douglas Harmon should have been the end. It should have been the moment when the Paquette family could finally grieve, finally heal, finally move on. But some wounds don't close just because the person who caused them is locked away. Margaret Paquette died 6 months after the trial. The doctors said it was heart failure, but Sandra knew the truth. Her mother had been running on hope for 7 years, and once that hope was fulfilled, there was nothing left to keep her going. She died in her sleep, peacefully, with a photograph of Terrence clutched in her hand. Sandra scattered her mother's ashes next to Terrence's grave, in a small cemetery on the edge of town. She stood there for hours, talking to them both, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, promising to keep their memory alive. Michael Paquette was 43 when the trial ended. He had been sober for almost a year, driven by the hope that he might finally be able to make peace with his brother's memory. When the verdicts were announced, he wept openly in the courtroom, not caring who saw, not caring what anyone thought. But Michael's journey wasn't over. He still carried the weight of that unfinished conversation, the one in the bar 2 days before Terrence vanished. If anything happens to me, what had Terrence wanted to tell him? What secret had died with his brother? Michael became obsessed with finding out. He tracked down the workers Terrence had been talking to. He read through the evidence that had been presented at trial. He visited Ray Dalton in prison, hoping for some insight, some closure, some final piece of the puzzle. What he learned changed everything. Terrence hadn't just been documenting safety violations. He had been documenting something much bigger. He had discovered that Douglas Harmon was embezzling money from the mill, skimming profits, and hiding them in offshore accounts while the workers struggled to make ends meet. The safety violations were just the tip of the iceberg. Terrence had been building a case that would have destroyed Harmon completely. That was why Harmon had acted so quickly. That was why he couldn't afford to let Terrence speak. The murder wasn't just about silencing a whistleblower. It was about protecting a fortune. Michael took this information to Thomas Reyes, who by now had been promoted to chief of the reconstituted Millbrook Police Department. Reyes launched a new investigation, following the money trail that Terrence had started 7 years earlier. What they found was staggering. Over 2 decades, Douglas Harmon had stolen nearly $4 million from the mill. Money that should have gone to workers' benefits. Money that should have been reinvested in safety equipment. Money that should have kept Millbrook prosperous instead of struggling. The discovery led to civil lawsuits. Workers who had been injured, families who had been cheated, a whole town that had been victimized by a man they trusted. The settlements came slowly, but they came. And when they did, something remarkable happened. Michael Paquette used his share to establish a fund in his brother's name, the Terrence Paquette Workers' Safety Foundation. It provided resources for whistleblowers, legal support for workers facing retaliation, and education about workplace rights. Terrence's legacy, which had been erased for 7 years, was now something permanent, something that would help others, something that meant his death hadn't been in vain. A town doesn't change overnight. It doesn't apologize for its sins or admit its failures just because someone tells it to. But slowly, painfully, Millbrook began to transform. The new leadership of the mill, A group of workers who had pooled their resources to buy it out of bankruptcy implemented every safety measure that Terrence had advocated for. They named the main building after him. They put his photograph in the lobby, along with a plaque that told his story. The townspeople who had stayed silent began to speak. One by one, they came forward with what they had known, what they had suspected, what they had been too afraid to say. Some sought forgiveness from Sandra and Michael. Some just needed to unburden themselves. There was the waitress from the diner, now elderly and frail, who finally admitted what she had overheard. There was the mechanic who had seen the damaged truck and said nothing. There was the pastor's widow, sharing the burden of a secret her husband had carried to his grave. Each confession was another brick removed from the wall of silence. Each admission was another step towards something like healing. But the most remarkable transformation was Michael Paquette himself. The man who had spent his life in his brother's shadow, who had struggled with addiction and anger and self-hatred, had become something new. He had found purpose in Terrence's legacy. He had found meaning in helping others. He had found the person he was always capable of being, hidden beneath years of disappointment and grief. Michael started speaking at high schools and community centers, telling his brother's story, talking about the cost of silence and the power of speaking up. He wasn't a polished speaker. He stumbled over his words sometimes. His hands shook when he stood in front of crowds. But that vulnerability made him effective. People saw themselves in his struggle. They heard their own regrets in his voice. They understood that redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying to be better, one day at a time. Sandra returned to Millbrook permanently in 2001. She took over her mother's old house, the one where she and her brothers had grown up, and turned it into an informal headquarters for the foundation. She kept her paralegal skills sharp by helping with the legal work, and she kept her promise to her mother by making sure Terrence's story was never forgotten. The siblings who had been so different, who had barely spoken during the years of uncertainty, became closer than ever. Michael's sobriety held. Sandra's anger softened into determination. Together, they built something from the ashes of their family's tragedy. And Millbrook, the town that had enabled a murder through its silence, began to speak with a different voice. A voice that valued truth over comfort. A voice that protected workers instead of exploiting them. A voice that refused to forget. In 2005, Ray Dalton died in prison. Cancer had been eating at him for months, but he refused treatment, telling anyone who would listen that he deserved every moment of pain. Before he died, he asked to see Michael Paquette one final time. Michael almost didn't go. He had forgiven Ray, in a way, because holding on to hatred was too exhausting, and because he understood that Ray had been a tool, not a mastermind. But facing the man who had helped kill his brother was something different. Something harder. In the end, it was Sandra who convinced him. "You'll regret it if you don't," she said. "Not because he deserves closure. Because you do." Michael drove to the prison on a Wednesday morning, sat in a cold visiting room, and waited for Ray Dalton to be wheeled in. The man he saw bore little resemblance to the person he remembered. Ray was skeletal, his skin gray, his eyes sunken. He looked like someone who had already died and was just waiting for his body to catch up. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Ray spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said something that night. "Your brother. After we grabbed him, before everything else. He said something I never forgot." Michael leaned forward, his heart pounding. This was the moment. This was the answer he had been seeking for 14 years. What did he say? Ray closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. He said, "Tell Michael I forgive him." Just like that. Like he knew we were going to, and like that was the most important thing. "Tell Michael I forgive him." Michael felt the room spinning. All those years of guilt. All those nights replaying the unfinished conversation. All the blame he had heaped on himself for not listening, for not being there, for not being good enough. And Terrence had known. Terrence had understood. In his final moments, Terrence hadn't thought about himself or his fear or his pain. He had thought about his little brother and the weight Michael would carry. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Michael asked, his voice breaking. Ray shook his head. I couldn't face it. Couldn't face you. But I'm dying, and I need you to know. He loved you. He wasn't disappointed in you. He wanted you to be free. Michael wept. He wept for the brother he had lost. He wept for the years of unnecessary guilt. He wept for the mercy of a man who had thought of others even as his own life was being stolen. Ray Dalton died 3 days later. Michael didn't attend the funeral, but he visited Terrence's grave that afternoon and sat there until sunset, finally able to hear the end of the sentence his brother had started so many years ago. If anything happens to me, forgive yourself. I'm telling you this story now because some things need to be remembered. Not just the tragedy, not just the injustice, but the triumph that came after. The redemption that was possible because people refused to give up. The Terrence Paquette Workers' Safety Foundation celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. It has helped thousands of workers across the country, providing resources, legal support, and most importantly, the courage to speak up when something is wrong. Sandra Paquette retired from active involvement in 2019, passing the leadership to a younger generation who never knew Terrence, but who carry his spirit forward. She lives quietly now, in the house where she grew up, surrounded by memories and photographs and the knowledge that she kept her promise to her mother. Michael Paquette still speaks at events, though less frequently than he used to. He's in his 70s now, still sober, still carrying his brother's message to anyone who will listen. He tells people that redemption is possible, that forgiveness is real, that even the deepest wounds can heal if you give them time and care. In Millbrook, the town that tried to bury the truth has become something unexpected, a model for transparency, a case study in how communities can acknowledge their failures and rebuild from them. The lumber mill still stands, still employs hundreds of workers, still bears Terrence Paquette's name on its main building. Every September, on the anniversary of Terrence's disappearance, the town holds a memorial. Workers and families gather to remember a man who saw injustice and refused to stay silent. They tell stories. They share memories. They recommit themselves to the values he died defending. Terrence Paquette was 34 years old when he was taken from the world. He never got to see the changes his courage inspired. He never got to watch his brother find peace. He never got to hold his mother's hand and tell her everything was going to be okay. But his legacy lives on, in the foundation that bears his name, in the town that finally found its conscience, in the brother who learned to forgive himself, in every worker who speaks up because they know someone will listen. Some stories end in tragedy. This one almost did. But the people who loved Terrence Paquette refused to let tragedy be the final word. They fought for truth. They demanded justice. They built something beautiful from the wreckage of something terrible. And that's why I'm telling you this story. Because if you're listening to this, if you've stayed until the end, then you understand something important. The silence that allowed Terrence to be forgotten is the same silence that protects injustice everywhere. The courage that finally broke that silence is the same courage that can change the world. What will you do with that understanding? Will you speak when speaking is hard? Will you listen when listening is inconvenient? Will you remember the people who have been erased and demand that their stories be told? Terrence Paquette asked those questions with his life. His family answered them with their fight for justice. Now it's your turn. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. And the next time you see something wrong, the next time silence seems like the easy choice, remember a man who chose differently. Remember Terrence Paquette. Remember that some things are worth risking everything for. And remember that every ending, no matter how dark it seems, can become a beginning if you refuse to give up. This is the story of Terrence Paquette in the 1990s. This is the story of a family that never stopped fighting. This is the story of a town that finally learned to speak. This is the story of how truth wins, even when it takes decades, even when it costs everything, even when it seems impossible. Truth wins. And now you know.